So who are you versing? I left you with this new verb at the end of the last lecture. What did you take this to mean? If you found it hard to figure out, let me give you a bit more context. You say to me, my soccer team is in the finals tonight. And I say, oh, so who are you versing? As in, who are you playing against? This new verb is back-formed from the Latin preposition versus, meaning against. Now, how did that happen? Well, we can't be sure exactly, but let's imagine kids hearing over and over in reference to games, the Tigers versus the Pirates, the Thunder versus the Heat, Federer versus Nadal. Kids could hear those latter two as very similar to the Thunder plays the Heat, Federer plays Nadal. So versus is just like plays, and plays has the verb play, so versus must have the verb verse. And so a new verb is born. It's just these kinds of processes of new word formation that we're going to talk about in this lecture. In the last lecture, we looked at how a word's meaning can change over time, broadening or narrowing, getting better or worse, undergoing a metaphorical extension. It's still the same word in terms of its form, but its meaning may change, sometimes quite radically, as we saw with the example of clue, which used to mean a ball of yarn. So that kind of semantic change is one of the major ways that the English lexicon changes over time. But we are also regularly adding new words to the lexicon. Now, when I say that, you may immediately think, well, of course, we're borrowing words. We're borrowing words all the time. And yes, we are borrowing words from other languages. But that is actually, at this point in the history of English, a fairly minor way that we expand the English lexicon. Much more of the time, we're creating new words based on the component parts already in the lexicon. We're taking the parts we have available to us already in the language, freestanding words, prefixes, suffixes, and then we manipulate those pieces. We take those to create something new. A fascinating thing about studying these new words is that they showcase what I like to call rule-governed human creativity. As we've been discussing, to be human is to be creative with language. We play with words. In fact, we love to play with words. And in the process, we often create new ones. But it's not an unconstrained creativity that allows us to make new words. We can't just make words however we want. As I'll be showing you in this lecture, there's actually a system underlying much of this creation, from new slang words to new internet technology to new technical and scientific jargon. Sometimes the new words we make are one-time occurrences, a word that we make up in the moment and we never use again. So, for example, let's imagine that you ask me for directions and I'm advising you about how to go, and I say, oh, don't take that road, it's very traffic lighty. Now, I know what I mean by traffic lighty, and you probably know what I mean by traffic lighty, as in there are a lot of traffic lights on that road, so it is slow. But there's a good chance that neither one of us is going to make traffic lighty a regular part of our vocabulary. Linguists call this a nonce word, or a nonce formation, a word made up for one occasion that does not live beyond that occasion. The phrase for the nonce, meaning for the particular purpose, shows up in Shakespeare's Henry IV, Part 1. Shakespeare himself had many nonce forms, many words that he made up for a particular purpose in his plays, at least from what we can tell. To give you an example, in Measure for Measure, he uses ungenitured to mean castrated, and that quotation is the only one for that word in the Oxford English Dictionary. So sometimes our lexical creativity is of the moment and for the moment, gone once we've uttered it. Unless, of course, we happen to be Shakespeare, in which case our nonce word might end up in the Oxford English Dictionary. But then there are all the new words that we make up that get picked up by others and become part of the English vocabulary. Be that part of general usage or part of a more specialized set of words among our friends or in a particular kind of science, for example. In most instances, we can't trace back a word to its very first user, and there may often be more than one who creates a word, and then with all of us creating that word, it slowly gets momentum and becomes a word in the lexicon. As I noted before, because English has borrowed so many words, many assume that borrowing accounts for most new words. And certainly, it was a major force in the history of English and remains relevant today. But in modern English, over 90% of new words are created from the parts that we already have in the language, as we combine, recombine, clip, smush, that's my very technical term for a process, and otherwise manipulate the language at our disposal. There are systematic processes at work that allow us to make these new words, even though it may feel like we're just doing it however we want to. We see ourselves just being playful, but the fact is that we can't combine things any which way. And in showing you these different processes, these different systems, I will be uncovering for you all the tacit knowledge that we bring to bear that allows us to be playful and creative. So here are the general processes we'll be talking about. Combining, including affixation and compounding. That is, linguists estimate, somewhere between 54 and 68% of new words. It's combining. Then there's the process of shortening, taking a word, making it shorter, probably 8 to 10% of new words. And then there's a process called functional shift, which is where we take a word that is one part of speech and we turn it into another part of speech, somewhere between 14 and 19% of new words. So let me start with combining. And within combining, as I mentioned, there's affixation and compounding. And we'll start with affixation, because here we can most clearly see the system that underlines our creativity. What do I mean? Well, let's take the word geek. And we're going to talk about my friend Catherine, who self-describes as a geek. We share a sense of how to play with this word if we want to describe my friend Catherine. Let me show you what I mean. We would say, she's very, and I think we would all fill in geeky there to make an adjective. If we then wanted to refer to Catherine's quality of being geeky, we'd say, I love it that she embraces her, and I think there we would all put in geekiness. Now, if her geekiness is completely over the top, what might we say? Super geekiness? Hyper geekiness? Then, let's imagine we wanted to compare her geekiness with my geekiness. We would say, oh, me. She out-geeks me. We just created several new words, and I would guess that we agreed on what most of them should be, if not all of them. And that is because there's a system here. Affixation is when we take one or more free morphemes, like geek, and then we attach one or more bound morphemes, these prefixes or suffixes. There are some more productive ones in English, prefixes like pre, re, cyber, and now e, suffixes like ness, y, the suffix y as in traffic lighty, or full. Now, what do I mean exactly that there are rules about these prefixes and suffixes? Well, one is that we know what they mean. For example, re means again. But we also know that re can only attach to verbs. So re plus write, rewrite. Re plus open, reopen. But we wouldn't say re-computer or re-sad. It just doesn't work that way. The suffix y typically attaches to nouns, ice to icy, bump to bumpy, mouse to mousy. Historically, it also sometimes attaches to verbs, so you can get cling to clingy. The suffix ness prefers adjectives: happiness, darkness, bitterness, reclusiveness, geekiness. But sometimes it can hook on to nouns: womanness or witness. Now let me give you a little etymological note here on witness. Witness is an Old English compound of wit, meaning mind, plus ness, and it meant knowledge. And from knowledge, it came to mean evidence or testimony, so knowledge of a particular event. And then it comes to mean the person who has knowledge of a particular event, who gives the evidence or testimony. Now, prefixes and suffixes are most common, but we can also make a new word with an infix. I used to teach with a textbook that said that English had prefixes and suffixes but no infixes, and this just isn't true. It's just that all the infixes in English are taboo words, but it is a systematic process for how we do infixation. If we take a word like fantastic and we want to put an infix in it, we would say fan-freaking-tastic. So you say, okay, it comes after the first syllable. Well, let's take the example absolutely. If you were going to put an infix in that, it would be abso-freaking-lutely. Okay, so it's not after the first syllable. The system is that the infix actually comes right before the stressed syllable, abso-freaking-lutely. And that is a very systematic process in English. You might say, what does that infix mean? And I like to call these infixes emphatic infixes. They just add emphasis to words. I think that we often don't give ourselves credit for these new words. We think we're just sticking on a prefix or a suffix, but they are new words, and there's more knowledge underlying that sticking on of a prefix or a suffix than we may realize. Another way of combining parts is compounding. If affixation is a free word and a bound morpheme, compounding is when we take two or more free words or morphemes and we bring them together to create something new. The meaning of some compounds is clear from the parts. So a goldfish is a kind of fish, a steamboat is a kind of boat. But the meaning of some compounds is much more idiomatic. A hatchback is a kind of car, and a soap opera is a kind of television show. I'm also interested in the relationship of the components of compounds, because it's not consistent. If you think about an earthquake, that's when the earth quakes. But a crybaby is when a baby cries. Or we could take a falling star, which is a star that is falling. But a baking apple is definitely not an apple that bakes things. Now, how do we know if these two free morphemes brought together are just two words that happen to be next to each other or are actually a compound? Well, we don't completely know, but stress is one clue. And let me show you what I mean. Let's think about the bluebird, the bird that we recognize, and we say, oh, it's a bluebird. That would be a compound. But let's imagine that I'm at the zoo and I see a bird that I don't recognize that happens to be blue. And I say, oh, look at that blue bird. You'll hear the difference in stress. In bluebird, the compound, stress is on the first syllable. The second one is unstressed. But when I was pointing out the bird at the zoo, they both were getting stress. Blue bird. You can hear that also in something like blackboard, which I have in my classroom, versus, oh, there's a red board and a black board. So we have affixation and compounding. This involves creating longer words. We also sometimes make shorter words, and we're going to turn to that now. This is something that many speakers think of as a fad, or that these shortenings are not real words. This isn't a real process. But in fact, these shortened words are very real words, and sometimes people forget that they were ever shortenings at all. We're going to talk about two major kinds of shortening. One is initialisms, and the other is clipping. We'll start with initialisms. Sometimes with an initialism, we say it as a word. We call these acronyms. So something like yuppie, a young urban professional, or NASA, or AIDS. I'm interested that sometimes these can become opaque for people. They're no longer sure what they stood for. I'm not sure everyone remembers that AIDS stands for Acquired Immune Deficiency Syndrome. Let's give you a few to see if you remember what they stand for. Scuba. That one you may know, self-contained underwater breathing apparatus. What about radar? Radio detection and ranging. And lastly, laser. This one actually has the acronym radar in it. Light wave amplification by stimulated emission of radar. So those are acronyms. We also have alphabetisms, which is where we say it as the letters themselves. So FBI, FYI, TMI, too much information, BFF, best friends forever. And then there's BTW, which I have to say I'm not sure is a very good alphabetism because it's really long. That W does not speed things up, but I have heard people say sometimes BT-dub. So we have initialisms as one way of shortening. Then we have clipping. Now clipping is just what it sounds like. We are clipping part of the word off. That could be the front, that could be the back. So off the front, we would get something like rents from parents, or do from hairdo. Blog is a clipping from weblog, and I'm interested in that one because we didn't clip off the whole first morpheme. We just clipped off the w, but kept the b with blog. Off the back, if we clip off the back, we get something like limo from limousine, rehab from rehabilitation, mic from microphone, and mob, which many people do not realize is a clipping. It comes from mobila vulgus, a Latin phrase meaning a fickle crowd. And Jonathan Swift at the beginning of the 18th century really did not like this clipping. And he was hoping it wouldn't make it, but clearly it did. Sometimes we clip both from the front and from the end of a word, so something like fridge from refrigerator. I'm very interested in the clipping that's happening with many young people right now, where they not only clip the word, but then they add an S. So we get whatevs from whatever and totes from totally. Now, some of these clippings probably feel slangy to you because they are, but some clippings are now entrenched in the language and no longer feel slangy or even like clippings. Flu is a clipping from influenza, phone from telephone, deli, lab, dorm. These to us now feel, I think, well established in the lexicon. So those are the ways that we create abbreves, which I think is a great clipping, and we've gone through ways that we create longer words as well. We'll now turn to a third highly productive process in English, and this is called functional shift. This is where we take a word that's one part of speech, and without changing its form, we turn it into another part of speech. Most often, we create nouns from verbs. So if I hire someone, I can have a new hire. If I commute to work, I can have a long commute, a short commute. If I cry, I can have a good cry, or maybe I had a good laugh. Can you think of how the verb know has become a noun? It has. It's fairly specialized, but we say something like, oh, I'm in the know. We can also take nouns and turn them into verbs. So trash was a noun, became a verb. Google started as a noun, as did video. Privilege was a noun before it was a verb, as was impact. And there are people who really don't like the verb impact. I've heard people say, only teeth are impacted. But the fact is, if you listen to usage, many things are impacted in today's society. Another kind of functional shift, we can take an adjective and turn it into a verb. So to clean is functional shift, as is to dirty. There's a wonderful Calvin and Hobbes cartoon where Calvin says, verbing weirds language. But I have to say that most of these functional shifts don't seem weird to us at all. And as I've said, it's important to remember that what seems noticeable to us now will probably seem unremarkable later. Benjamin Franklin didn't like the functional shift of notice as a move from a noun to a verb. Now we don't even notice, so to speak. So there I've talked about some of the major word formation processes, how we make new words. Let's turn to a few minor ones. We'll talk about blends, back formation, and reduplication. First, blends. This gets us back to smooshing, the technical term I used before. This is when we take two words and we blend them together or smush them. Smog is smoke and fog. A motel, a motor, hotel. Guesstimate is a blend, as is netiquette. There's a fairly new one, a bromance, which is a very close male friendship. Chillax, chilling and relaxing, and a word that my students taught me recently, which is adorkable. And I have to say, as soon as I learned the word adorkable, I thought, I know all kinds of adorkable people who do adorkable things. These are called portmanteau words sometimes. That comes from Lewis Carroll's Through the Looking Glass. And Humpty Dumpty is creating these kinds of new words, and he says, well, slithy means lithe and slimy. You see, it's like a portmanteau. There are two meanings packed up into one word. So Humpty Dumpty explaining to us that it's like those suitcases with two sides, and you close them up, and you have one word. Some of the blends I've given you probably to you sound, again, very new. Some of them sound like slang, but there are blends that, again, are well established in the language, including chortle from Lewis Carroll, and then a word like brunch. But I haven't yet gotten my head around the new blend merce, which is, I'm told, a male purse. So those are blends. Another minor word formation process is back formation. This is where we take a word in the language and we reanalyze the parts. And from that, we create a new word. It's easiest to show you this by example. We borrowed into English the word beggar in the 13th century. You can even see from the spelling, which ends with AR, that it's not a verb plus a suffix. But when you hear beggar, it sure sounds a lot like baker. And if a baker bakes, then a beggar must beg. And so speakers back-formed beg from beggar. English had the word diagnosis before we had the verb diagnose. That was back-formed from diagnosis. Television gives us the verb televise. Lazy gives us the verb laze. I mean, if you're lazy, what are you doing? Well, you must be lazing around. Most of those are well-established back formations, but there are new ones happening that people notice. Enthuse from enthusiasm. Conversate from conversation. And you can see the reanalysis there from converse plus ation to conversate plus shun. On my campus, I hear people talking about orientating other people. So we've gone from orientation to back-forming orientate. And I think that there's arguably a difference between orientate and orient. That for me, if you're orienting someone, that's about north-south, east-west. You're getting your bearings directionally. But if you're orientating someone to campus, you're showing them where the financial aid office is. So that's back formation. A third minor word formation process is reduplication. There are a couple of kinds of reduplication. In one form, you get the same word twice, but you get a change, for example, in the vowel. So flip-flop, mishmash. Other times, you get no change. We just get a reduplicated form. Oh, that's a no-no. And I'm interested that we don't have a yes-yes. We only have a no-no. We've talked about yada-yada or yada-yada-yada, which is reduplication. Bling started as a reduplicated form. Bling, bling. Now, those are reduplicated words. There's also reduplication in discourse, and I'm really interested in this. This is something we do on the fly, and let me give you some examples. When I sometimes will talk with students, or I'll hear students talking with each other, and they'll say, "Oh, I'm going home." And another student will say, "Oh, are you going home? Which is about, are you going to where your family is as opposed to your house on campus? Or you will hear someone says, "I got a job." "Oh, is it a job?" Which I believe is, are you getting paid? I heard someone say, "I bought a car," and the question I heard, "Oh, a car?" And I believe they were trying to distinguish a car from an SUV. What we're doing when we reduplicate forms that way is we're actually, I think, trying to get to a prototypical meaning. So a car is this the prototypical car, as opposed to something that might count as a car but is not prototypical, or a prototypical job, or a prototypical home, which would be where your family is. So why do we make new words? Well, there are a few answers to that question. One is because we can, because the language allows us to do that, and the creative human mind takes what we have and makes new words. Another is because if we make new words, it can sometimes let us express better what we want to say, or it lets us express something differently than what we already have. It can give us a personal style, or it can let us express that we're part of a community that talks in a particular way. Sometimes we make new words because we need them. Technology has spawned all kinds of new words because when we get new things, we have to have a way to talk about them. One of the things that can happen when we make new words is that you get something called a retronym. And a retronym is a word that's formed in response to a new word. Again, easier by example. We used to just have mail. You would get mail. But once we got email, there was a need to differentiate regular mail from email. And so you'll hear things either regular mail or snail mail. Once people had cell phones, we needed to say that there were landlines, because it used to be that you just had a phone and it was clear that that was a landline. Desktop happened because there were laptops. And you hear people say, "Oh, tap water," because now we have bottled water and we need to distinguish tap water. So, to conclude, we will talk a lot about borrowing in lectures to come. But it's important to remember that most new words are the result of our own creativity as we systematically put together components already available in the language. This is so common because this way we can use a new word and be pretty sure that our listeners will understand what we mean because they recognize the parts and they know the process, the systematic process by which we put those together. To return to Lewis Carroll and Humpty Dumpty, at one point in Alice in Wonderland, Humpty Dumpty says, "When I use a word, it means just what I choose it to mean, neither more nor less." But that is Wonderland. The world in which we live, we need to communicate in ways that other people understand. I can't just use a word the way I want it to mean, and you can do whatever you want. So when I use traffic lighty, I assume that you know what I mean when I put that Y onto traffic lighty. With Facebook, when people made the verb to friend, they had to assume that people would understand that functional shift, that it means to make someone a friend. And once you had friend as a verb, you could create new verbs like unfriend, or perhaps refriend if you unfriend someone on Facebook and then refriend them. And of course, all of this is happening on Facebook, which has also become a verb to Facebook. It should also give us a perspective on the new words that we notice and may think are somehow illegitimate or not real words. They are very real words, even if they are slangy. Some of them will prove to be short-lived or short-lived, depending on how you want to say that word, but many will remain and become fully unremarkable to later generations. I'm curious to see how verse will do, whether it will become unremarkable or whether it will die. So in the past 2 lectures, we've looked at how existing words take on new meanings and how we make new words. We'll now turn our attention to how words change pronunciation over time. We will look at a word like often. How seriously should we take the spelling here? Should we pronounce that T in often and say it often? I will give you a historical perspective on that question as well as an answer in the next lecture.